King Richard II never thought the rebels would make it to London.
The boy king and his ministers had been taken completely by surprise by the speed and scale and escalation of this uprising.
But by the 15th of June, 1381, the rebels were there. They'd taken control of the city and held it for 2 days. Now the king had to meet them face to face.
This would be the high tide of the revolt in London, where the rebels are showing just how much power they have.
The king and his courtiers had fled to the Tower of London, but the rebels had stormed it.
It looks as if the southeast of England has slipped completely from the control of the king, the king's ministers, the aristocracy and the church.
Richard set out to meet a party of rebels at Smithfield. With him were 200 of his men, heavily armed.
His ministers were obviously worried about their king, who's only 14 years old at this time. He was surrounded by men who were certainly armed and whose priority would have been his personal protection.
The royal party were at the east side of the field. The rebels kept to the west.
It's one of the great confrontations between individuals in English and British history.
The air was thick with tension. No one knew what would happen next. There'd already been so much destruction.
A mixture of the targeted demolition of buildings, it's the looting and ransacking of properties. Individuals are, in some cases, murdered.
The Mayor of London approached the rebels and called for their leader, Wat Tyler.
Tyler is undoubtedly the most powerful rebel leader in London at this time.
He'd forced the king to meet him here at Smithfield and listen to his demands.
It would have been one of the most remarkable dialogues in English history. Richard II, grandson of Edward III, the son of the Black Prince, heir to one of the wealthiest and most powerful monarchies in Europe, facing Wat Tyler, the man who had emerged only less than a week before as the rebel leader.
What happened between them in the next few minutes would change the course of English history forever. For BBC Radio 4, this is History's Heroes. People with purpose, brave ideas, and the courage to stand alone. I'm Alex von Tunzelmann, I'm a historian, and today's episode is about Wat Tyler. For 6 days in 1381, this mysterious, charismatic figure seemed to hold the balance of power in England. Fired by a vision of social equality, he led a peasants' revolt that threatened to overturn the ruling order and create a more just and egalitarian medieval society. A climate crisis, a devastating pandemic, an ever-widening gap between the rich and the poor. This was England in 1381.
This seems to be a system that is on the verge of crisis.
Alistair Dunn is a medieval historian and author of The Peasants Revolt, a history of the revolt of 1381.
England looked like a society where a secure ruling elite was in control, yet within a matter of weeks, that seemed to be on the verge of collapse.
But who was Wat Tyler, the man whose name became synonymous with the revolt?
We don't really know anything about Wat Tyler's prehistory. We don't know whether it's simply through his force of personality and drive that puts him in charge of this rebel group, or whether he had had some previous leadership experience.
Some chronicles associated him with the town of Maidstone. Others said he was from Colchester. The name Tyler itself might tell us something about his profession, tiling roofs, and what might be a shortened form of Walter, but historians have found few traces of him before 1381.
He's a mysterious figure in terms of his origins, but what is certainly the case is that in the sort of first and second weeks of June, Tyler emerges as a leading figure in the 1381 revolt.
Leading up to the point where such an obscure man could challenge the king, England had undergone a series of catastrophes.
England in the 14th century got off to a bad start.
Most of the country was under a system of serfdom. Somewhere between 80 and 90% of the population lived in the countryside as tenants, farming land on behalf of the landowners. It was a mean and gruelling life.
Their days would have been spent in the management of livestock, in the cultivation of arable crops, on compulsory labour, where they owed a certain number of days of service to their lord. So this was not an easy existence.
A sudden change in climate during the century produced a series of bad harvests. The bad weather also took a toll on animal herds, with sheep, cows and horses dying. Famine followed. And then came a deadly pandemic, the bubonic plague.
The impact of the plague coming out from Central Asia across Europe is truly devastating. Modern estimates of fatalities are now rising to sort of 40% plus of Europe's population.
The Black Death changed everything.
Before the Black Death, there was an oversupply of population relative to available land. But after the Black Death, really the tables were turned on the landlord class, because those surviving people who are living in the countryside, they could put a much higher price on their own labour and their own service.
Landlords didn't want to pay the peasants more. Parliament capped wages at the rate they'd been before the plague. This fuelled the peasants' anger, but they had no democratic means to express it.
The vast majority of people in medieval Europe did not have any direct representation or say in the governance of the kingdoms and states they lived in.
Then, in 1377 and 79, another blow. The Chancellor demanded poll taxes. These poll taxes were extracted from almost every man and woman, regardless of whether they could afford it or not. The taxes were incredibly unpopular, but in 1380, the Chancellor issued another.
It's so socially regressive in the sense that for a great lord, a tax of a few pence per head, that would have been certainly affordable to them. But for the ordinary people of England, another flat rate tax on top of the two previous ones was one that many felt that they could not tolerate.
Parliament was assembled in Northampton to pass this third poll tax.
They probably felt that it was easier to manage popular anger in Northampton than it would have been in London, which was quite an edgy city in terms of its politics.
What had driven the king and his advisers to risk yet another collection?
There's a war that's going increasingly wrong.
England had been at war with France for decades in what would become known as the 100 Years' War. At the beginning, there'd been one English victory after another.
The war had been profitable to England in terms of its reputation, its wealth through the conquest of territory and indeed the capture of high-value hostages, even the King of France himself in 1356.
But in the 1370s, England suffered a run of humiliating military disasters. The king desperately needed more money. Parliament knew the tax was a risk, but felt it had no choice. So the tax was proclaimed and rigorously enforced. Investigators were sent out with wide powers to make sure every town and village complied.
The policing was aggressive and helped to bring about the first flames of uprising.
At the end of May 1381, there was unrest in Essex.
Organised resistance began very much at village and hamlet level. We were talking about small numbers, but it seems very clear that these sentiments of resistance and anger were shared because the flame of revolt spreads very, very quickly.
In Brentwood, protests were violent.
Unpopular landlords were attacked. Their properties were ransacked or looted or in some cases burnt down.
While Essex burned, another uprising began in Kent. This one had a strong sense of purpose and a charismatic leader.
References to Wat Tyler's leadership tend to emerge round about the 6th or 7th of June, when you have rebels entering the town of Rochester, which was an ancient town with a massive Norman castle and cathedral.
There were stories that for Tyler it was personal. It was said that a collector of the poll tax sexually assaulted his daughter and that Tyler killed him with a hammer. Centuries later, historians can't prove if that story is true. What does seem certain is that Tyler, like many others, had been primed for revolt by the sermons of a radical cleric, John Ball.
Who'd been a thorn in the side of England's government since its 1370s.
Ball travelled around England preaching social equality. He wrote short poems or chants which spread among the peasantry.
John the miller hath grown small, small, small. The King, Son of Heaven, shall pay for all. Beware or be ye woe. Know your friend from your foe. Have enough and say ho. And do well and better and flee sin. And seek peace and hold you therein.
These cryptic poems seemed to refer to an impending day of reckoning, and Wat Tyler heeded the call. He led a band of rebels to seize Rochester Castle.
Rochester Castle was designed to withstand sieges from invading French forces. So this is where the revolt is shifting from being a relatively contained uprising to one that is actually threatening the monarchy's control over significant parts of the southeast of England.
It was an astonishing victory. But the ongoing war with France had trained many ordinary people to fight. Now they dusted off their weaponry and joined Wat Tyler's peasant army.
Billhooks and agricultural implements through to bows, and of course when official buildings are ransacked, in particular when castles are ransacked, they would have then have had access to more formal military weaponry.
Some said that Wat Tyler had been an archer in the war. By the 10th of June, he'd gathered 4,000 rebels. They marched on Canterbury. Canterbury was the centre of religious authority in southern England, but it had more than spiritual significance to the rebels. The Archbishop, Simon Sudbury, was one of the architects of the poll tax.
Those who are too closely associated with the unpopular policies, their lives are now in immediate danger.
The Archbishop was in London at the time, but the rebels took the city.
Once Tyler and his group have shown themselves capable of taking cities such as Canterbury, then they really are now posing a significant threat to the stability of the kingdom as a whole.
The number of rebels swelled. The peasant army, under the command of Wat Tyler, was now estimated to include 60,000 men.
He clearly had a capacity to unify and direct, because he is able to shift his revolt out from being a purely county-based uprising in Kent to actually approaching the city of London.
On the 11th of June, Tyler led the rebels to march on the capital.
Getting into a town like Rochester or Canterbury is one thing, but gaining access through the gates of a walled city such as London, that is an achievement of a different order of magnitude.
The rebels' progress was almost miraculous, or at least that's how it seemed to them. For the king, his courtiers and the landlord class, this uprising was an abomination.
A complete inversion of the social order.
And it couldn't have come at a worse time. The king was a child.
The long-reigning king, Edward III, dies in 1377. But his eldest son, Edward, Prince of Wales, has predeceased him the previous year in 1376. So the English crown jumps a generation to the very young Richard II, who's 10 and a half years old when he becomes king.
Richard inherited so many problems, war, famine, disease, that it took a while to realise there was an immediate threat from revolution. But now it was at their door.
Richard II and his court moved from Westminster to the Tower of London on the 12th of June, and it seems that they hadn't really registered the scale and threat of this uprising until that time.
The world had turned upside down. On the march to London, the rebels overtook the king's mother, Joan, Princess of Wales. Joan had been visiting Kent and was hurrying back to the capital. The rebels exchanged bawdy jokes with her.
She's the mother of the king, and for her to find herself having this sort of dialogue with these rebels, men from a very, very different social background to her, must have been shocking and surprising, to say the least.
Wat Tyler and his men felt entitled to speak with royalty as equals, but they hadn't lost their reverence for the crown.
The rebels seem to have invested in the king the belief that he can solve their difficulties. So this is not an anti-monarchical revolt. This is a revolt where many of the rebels seem to look to the king for leadership.
The rebels hailed each other with a call that paid homage to the king.
One of the sort of phrases that the rebels use is, who do you hold with? And the correct answer is with King Richard and the true Commons. So the idea that somehow the ordinary people are not in opposition to the king, but are somehow aligned with him.
That's what brought the rebels to London. They believed that if they could speak to Richard himself, they could persuade him to grant their demands. On the 13th of June, the rebels crossed London Bridge and entered the city.
The City of London had a very self-confident ruling elite, but this is a point where it looks as if London and the South East are now completely under the rebels' control.
Wat Tyler tried to maintain discipline, discouraging the rebels from looting.
They're not presenting themselves as being out there for material gain through theft or robbery, but that they have political objectives that they believe that Richard can satisfy.
But some targets were irresistible. For years now, public anger had been focused on one aristocrat, John of Gaunt.
He is extraordinarily wealthy, head and shoulders above any other nobleman in England in terms of the scale of his estates and inheritances.
At a time when England was so strapped for cash that it was shaking down its poorest subjects for pennies, John of Gaunt boasted dozens of castles and estates, multiple fortunes, and a colossal income. What was more, he'd led some of England's most disastrous campaigns against the French.
His military expeditions seldom delivered what they were supposed to achieve militarily, but also at great financial cost.
John of Gaunt's most prized estate was the Savoy Palace. It was an opulent residence on the Thames, containing a wardrobe said to surpass that of every prince in Christendom.
The rebels storm it and ransack it thoroughly. Clothing, tapestries, furniture.
But the man himself was not there. John of Gaunt was on a diplomatic mission to the Scottish court, far removed from the uprising.
He is a very lucky man. Had Gaunt been in London, it's difficult to see him surviving.
Hiding with the king in the Tower of London were other men the rebels loathed, including Sir Robert Hales, the king's treasurer, and his Lord Chancellor, Simon Sudbury, the Archbishop of Canterbury. These were the two men seen as most responsible for the poll tax.
The Tower of London was formidably defended, so Richard may well have felt he was untouchable by the rebels, but in fact, the rebels gain access to the Tower of London on the 14th of June.
They demanded that the king come to meet them beyond the city walls at Mile End. Richard had no choice but to agree. He left the tower, leaving his Lord Chancellor and Treasurer behind.
And they are brutally executed by the rebels.
Tyler's rebels surely felt justified in beheading these men, but the violence went further than that.
One of the darker episodes of the revolt is an anti-immigrant element to that violence.
London was home to several merchant communities from overseas, and one of them attracted particular hatred.
Flemish weavers were operating under licence in London, and they were resented for the economic competition that they represented to others.
Some rebels went after the weavers. Dozens were murdered in the streets. Not all of these murders were political.
There were individuals who took the opportunity to settle their own private scores inside London under the cover of the broader wave of violence.
Though Wat Tyler lost control of some of his men, he was focused on his mission. And when the king arrived at Mile End, it seemed Tyler might be in a position to force real change. Historians disagree about whether Wat Tyler was at Mile End or whether he was at the Tower while the king was away.
We have an awful lot that was written by the rebels' enemies, but we don't really have much written by the rebels themselves explaining their actions and their goals.
But this was no mere riot. The rebels wanted a new social order. Now the king took an extraordinary step to satisfy them.
Richard actually issued a number of charters for men to take back to their own counties, saying that serfdom had ended.
When Richard returned to the Tower, the rebels at Mile End must have felt that they'd achieved the impossible. Serfdom was over. Many of them were satisfied and began their journeys home, but not Wat Tyler.
The Kent rebels seem to have had a much harder position than those other rebels. They wanted more.
On the following day, the 15th of June, that was the message Tyler sent. Richard came out again to meet the rebels at Smithfield. By now there was bad blood on both sides. Tyler approached the king. There are different accounts of what was said.
One of the most quoted chroniclers, called the Anonymale Chronicle, suggests that there was a radical agenda of social levelling that Wat Tyler brought to Richard II.
In this new social order, there would be no lordship in England except that of the king.
So effectively, all the powers the aristocracy had, that men like John of Gaunt had, would be swept away.
The tiers of English society would be flattened out. Throughout the kingdom, there'd be equality for all.
If that agenda was indeed presented on the 15th of June, it would have been an exceptionally radical set of demands for the late 14th century.
Even the way Tyler engaged with the king seemed astonishingly new and bold.
There's an account where he calls the king his brother and says that he will have thousands of loyal subjects at his side. By that, Tyler means the rebels. There's one account where he's described as kneeling and shaking the king by the elbow, not by the hand. So quite a lot of tactility, quite a lot of physical contact there between Tyler and Richard.
Other chronicles depict Tyler as a brute.
Another account just describes Tyler as very uncouthly rinsing his mouth out with a jug of water and then demanding a jug of ale that he then proceeds to drink from greedily.
Everything depended on how the king himself perceived the rebel leader. Was Tyler an upstart troublemaker, or did he represent the future?
Some interpretations of the revolt have suggested that Richard had a great deal of sympathy for the rebels.
That was not how things went.
During that encounter where Wat Tyler and his Kent rebels are confronting the king, there is a scuffle.
No one can say for certain what happened, but the Mayor of London struck Tyler with his dagger. Possibly Tyler drew a dagger first and threatened the king. Maybe it was a trap laid by one side or the other. But then a royal esquire ran Tyler through with a sword, over and over again.
When Richard sees Tyler being stabbed and mortally wounded, and he seems to perceive that the rebels are potentially about to attack him, maybe drawing their bowstrings ready to fire at him, the young king has the presence to actually present himself in front of the rebels and say that he will be their leader.
Wat Tyler was dead.
The sudden death of Wat Tyler marks the bursting of the bubble of the revolt in London, and Richard suddenly emerges as a confident, independent actor.
Tyler's body was decapitated.
His head is publicly displayed as a way of symbolising the power of the monarch over the body of traitors, but also clearly a message to others that this is the fate that awaits those who rebel.
Without their leader, the rebels had no idea what to do.
The rebels from Kent after Tyler's death seem to be completely astounded by his loss. No other individual emerges to take his place. It seems that all of the energy has been removed from their presence in London.
The king cancelled his own charters of emancipation. Serfdom was back in force.
Later in his reign, Richard shows himself to be quite brittle, quite authoritarian as a monarch, and seems to have little sympathy for any insurrection against his rule.
And he didn't stop at restoring serfdom.
The uprising is suppressed with high levels of violence. The higher level leaders are hunted down brutally. Hundreds of rebels are hanged for their role in the revolt.
The cleric John Ball, whose sermons had stoked the first flames of uprising, was hunted down. He was hanged, drawn and quartered under the supervision of the king. His head was impaled on a spike and displayed on London Bridge. By autumn 1381, King Richard II's lust for revenge had been satisfied.
I suspect there was a recognition that if the pre-existing order was to be re-established, then there's a certain point where the violent retribution needs to cease.
Alistair Dunn's History of the Revolt is subtitled England's Failed Revolution of 1381. But in some ways, Wat Tyler's rebellion succeeded.
And actually, Richard II and John of Gaunt and the leading ministers around him actually pursue a peace strategy towards France from the mid-1380s onwards.
Though these signs of progress could be attributed to the revolt, Wat Tyler was an awkward figure in the chronicles of the time and in the historical works that came after.
Wat Tyler and the other leaders of 1381 have been rather written out of English political history. They are perhaps too hot to handle. They challenge the existing social order. There's considerable violence associated with what they do.
Tyler has been seen as a hero by some and a villain by others.
He is cited by political conservatives, especially in the 17th century, as an example of what can go wrong when power falls into the hands of those from below. But then, during the Enlightenment period in the 18th century, Tyler is cited as an example of someone who is acting in the public good.
Though Wat Tyler was a real person, English culture preferred to celebrate a fictional character who took from the rich and gave to the poor.
It's interesting how the essentially fictional character of Robin Hood has gained so much currency as being the acceptable face of insurrection and revolt, whereas the real figures of 1381, who put their lives on the line, many of whom lost their lives, have in many respects been airbrushed out of the national story.
The legacy of Wat Tyler demonstrates how far rebels can get, even against the most repressive of regimes.
Before 1381, no one realistically could have predicted that scale of uprising. And so perhaps one of the messages we could take from this is that systems that may look very secure can potentially be vulnerable to dramatic political change.
Tyler showed an ordinary person can come out of nowhere and stand face to face with a king.